Welcome to the Minnesota Rovers Tuesday evening presentation. Minnesota Rovers is an outdoors club based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Our members organize trips that range from 1 hour to 2 weeks in Minnesota or further afield. Examples of our activities include hiking, biking, backpacking, skiing, snowshoeing, paddling, and rock climbing. We also organize conservation and trail clearing trips. Our members have experience and skills in many outdoor activities, so if you want to learn a new outdoor activity, we can probably help you. For more information, go to mnrovers.org. Now let's move on to this week's presentation.
Tonight, you're here to hear about wolf restoration in Isle Royale National Park. Many of you have heard about some of our other presentations from earlier about the unique wolf and moose relationship. Rolf Peterson is here to talk about his research that he's been doing over the last 50 years and the indirect effects of wolves on the Isle Royale ecosystem. So with that, Rolf, I am going to hand it over to you. Welcome.
This title slide allows me to, reminds me to acknowledge the organizations and agencies that have funded the wolf research at Isle Royale in recent years. Our primary source of funds over many decades has been the National Science Foundation, which is a federal agency that funds research at universities. Then, of course, Michigan Tech, which has been my academic home for quite a while. And then the National Park Service, which is the federal agency that manages Isle Royale National Park. I should also acknowledge John Vustich and Sarah Hoy, who are the co-principal investigators for the wolf moose study, and they're the ones who actually do the hard work these days of writing proposals and writing technical papers, and I do the fun stuff for the most part. So I'll describe recent events at Isle Royale, which led to the National Park Service in a rather bold move in 2019 and 20. They introduced a whole new population of wolves at Isle Royale because the first one basically sputtered out. Ultimately, the problem arises from climate change. And in this part of the world, the major footprint of climate change is shorter winters and warmer winters, and also windier winters. And that combination of changes means that ice doesn't form between Isle Royale and the Canadian and Minnesota mainland as often as it used to. So just in the time I've been going to Isle Royale from the 60s to the present, ice bridges have declined dramatically from about 8 years out of 10 down to maybe one out of 4 or worse. And it's all, of course, related to global changes that are anthropogenic in nature. So what it meant was when there's no more ice, it effectively isolates the wolf population of Isle Royale from any incoming wolves who would bring new genetic material. And the Isle Royale population is so small that genetic inbreeding is inevitable without renewal from new wolves that occasionally come in. And in the last 70 years, perhaps that's happened maybe twice. So it doesn't take very much, but it is quite important in terms of long-term sustainability. So when you look at the now 64-year history of wolves and moose on Isle Royale, you get this very dynamic graph. The green is moose and the red is wolves. So I guess if you stand back and look enough at it, they're sort of inversely proportional, and that's because wolves eat moose and have a lot to do with the density of moose on the island at any given time. But overlaying all of this is an awful lot of complexity introduced by the weather and by ticks and by moose forage and insect pathogens of the plants. And so it's even though the island is very small and it has only a simple predator-prey system, wolves, moose, and supplemented by beaver, it's really very complicated. The red arrow there in the bottom shows when wolves were introduced. We knew, as scientists studying the population, we knew back in about 2009 that things were not going well. And the wolf population indeed was heavily inbred and would probably go extinct. And so it took about 5 years before the Park Service really took it seriously. And then at about a 3-year environmental impact study followed. And then finally in 2019, 18 and 19, the Park Service signed off on a plan to restore wolf predation, a brand new population, because the previous population had been reduced to simply 2 individuals, heavily both related, father and daughter, and unable to reproduce. So the Park Service moved very quickly and introduced 19 wolves over a period of about 18 months, and that has led to resurgence in wolves. They're doing very well, and it managed to turn the corner on the moose population, which is now in decline and in fact in free fall, I would say. You can see more about the wolf moose study every year in an annual report, which is online on our website, and that comes out every year in the spring, and we should have another one out hopefully in another month or so. And these photos are examples of some of the new wolves, most of them born on Isle Royale in 2020. And a little plug for our Michigan Attorney General, who was running for re-election last year when I put this slide program together. So I gave her a little political plug. It's unusual for a state attorney general to petition the federal government to keep management of wolves in federal hands, but that's the position of the Michigan Attorney General, telling the federal government, please just keep the wolf, and we don't want it at this time. So the actual translocation of wolves brought wolves from 4 different areas, basically from the Lake Superior shoreline. There was a desire to introduce local wolves that are pre-adapted to this general environment, and then also to get a diversity of genetic combinations introduced right at the beginning, so that hopefully there'd be enough genetic diversity to produce a longer run time for the new population. So 4 wolves were brought over initially from the Grand Portage band of Lake Superior Chippewa, and then 11 wolves were brought from Ontario, 8 from an island in the eastern part of Lake Superior called Michipicoten Island. And that's a very significant story within this story. And then a few from mainland Ontario, and then finally 4 wolves from mainland Michigan were brought in. And they were captured by helicopter, darted from helicopter, net gun from helicopters, trapped sometimes. So a variety of methods were used to acquire mainland wolves. But virtually every agency provided valuable assistance, from Native American tribes to the state departments in Michigan and Minnesota. Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources was key in getting a lot of wolves from across the border. The governor of Michigan and the premier of Ontario had to discuss this to get all the administrative details ironed out. But the deed was done, and it's led to exactly what we had all hoped. I was hoping, besides just establishing wolves, to maybe get some black wolves in the population. The black coat color in wolves, we now know from studies in Yellowstone, is caused by one gene called the K locus. And it's in addition to producing black wolves, which are much easier for us to see and distinguish, it provides some immunity against canine distemper. And that, in fact, is probably what keeps the gene in the wolf genome because of this disease resistance. Because otherwise, if you get two copies of this gene, you tend to live a shorter life. In any case, I was hoping for some black wolves, and Ontario actually did produce some, but they have not survived to, to actually reproduce. But 16Ms, male 16 was a really magnificent wolf who at one point, one winter, seemed to have some hope of reproducing because he teamed up with female 11, who was this very attractive gray wolf who was sleeping when I took her picture. And I'll give you a little bit about their story, but they didn't own a territory. And that means you've got a really long uphill battle to reproduce and carve out a territory of their own. They tried hard, and in the end, they failed. Let's see if I can. The 11 and 16 pair are represented on this lower map by the green line. And you can see that they really danced around the edges of the West Pack, which is in yellow in the upper map. But 11 found that she was safe only by swimming out to these outer islands. If you've been to Isle Royale, it's Washington Island and Thompson Island and Johns Island. And she hung out there, killed beaver, killed moose calves occasionally. She basically ate all the beavers on Washington Island. And then in the middle of the winter in 2020, I believe it was, she went down to this part of the island, the middle of the island on the North Shore, and picked up that black male and brought him all the way back down to the West End. And then in the middle of February, breeding season, there were whitecaps on the lake. There was no ice, and she got that new mate of hers to swim out to the islands. He must have thought this is crazy, but they were safe on those islands and probably mated. But the following spring, the skull of 11F was found where she'd been killed by other wolves, and we never saw 16M again. So I think he was likewise probably killed. So that was the last hope we had of black wolves on the island. But otherwise, the two main territorial packs up here in the upper map did very well, reproduced right away. They've each reproduced every year since they formed. In spite of the best efforts of all the people involved in the translocation to avoid inbreeding, which in the upper right there, that that red territory formed when a brother and sister from Michipicoten Island mated and had pups. So right out of the gate, there was inbreeding, close inbreeding. But 15F, the female, only reproduced 1 year and then she disappeared. And so it was a brief period of inbreeding. But then when you look at the males in both of the reproducing packs, 7M and 12M are both brothers. So all the wolves reproduced at Isle Royale since the translocation are, if not the product of a sibling pair, they're all cousins. And that's not necessarily a death sentence, but we'll see how it all works out. But the wolves don't consider themselves to have any problems at all, and they're flourishing very nicely. Since the original translocation, the National Park Service has tried to keep wolves, a few wolves, a couple maybe in each pack, radio collared just to make them a little easier to find and monitor. So this is the technique of darting a wolf from a helicopter, which is probably a lot more hazardous for the people involved than it is for the wolves. The moose population, when the wolf population was low for about 10 years, the moose population expanded by about fourfold in a decade and produced a really unsupportable density of moose that was guaranteed to ruin their own food supply, the forest. And saving the forest was the ultimate goal of the National Park Service in putting wolves back on the island. So a lot has to do with the survival of calves. Moose calves are born in May. Most of them are born in about a 10-day period. And the survival of those calves has a lot to do with whether the moose population will increase or not. And for about 10 years, most of the moose calves were surviving and growing, and that's what produced the increasing moose population. Since wolves were introduced, calf survival has dropped by an order of magnitude. In fact, this past winter, we saw fewer calves than we've ever seen in the past 60 years in terms of a percent. So the wolf predation is essentially chopping off the reproductive portion of the moose population, and that's leading to a rather immediate decline, which is what the hope was, actually. And then moose have been dying. Adult moose have been dying, of course. Wolves have been preying on moose about the way we hoped they would, but at a pretty high level. And then also in 2022, quite a few moose starved to death. And that was probably exacerbated or ultimately caused by a severe drought the previous summer, which produced, had effects in the plants themselves and ultimately in the moose. I should mention, because of the nature of your club, that we have sort of an advanced backpacking exercise that we call Moose Watch. For backpackers who have a lot of experience and who want to backpack off trail for about a week and look for moose carcasses and bones. And it's kind of a niche activity, but if you search the internet for Moose Watch, I think we're the only outfit out there with that name. So, and we do have a few openings this year, but we're mostly full up, but something for you to consider if you really get into backpacking. Ticks, winter ticks are an issue for moose. It's one of those complicating factors. The winter tick is a white-tailed deer parasite, and virtually all deer are exposed to them, and most of them are host to ticks. But what white-tailed deer do is they groom themselves and they groom each other and get those ticks off of them, so they're not plagued by winter ticks the way moose are. But moose are originated in Eurasia, and they've only been in contact with white-tailed deer for about 8,000 to 10,000 years, and that's not long enough for moose to evolve resistance or more adaptive behavior to get rid of these ticks. So the ticks climb on moose in October, and then they just keep climbing on until there's a frost. And then those ticks start embed in moose and draw blood. And a moose may have tens of thousands of ticks on it by January. And then it starts to itch. And then moose start rubbing their hair off, bite their hair off, and all the while beginning to suffer from anemia. And a moose can have so many ticks on it by February that the ticks are able to remove the entire blood supply of the moose. So the moose, at the worst time of year, has to engage in the energetic activity of reproducing its own blood supply. So it's a huge energetic demand at the worst time of year. And this radio-collared moose was captured in February of last year, radio collar attached. And the inset photo shows ticks on one of his patches of skin. And he died April 14th last spring, basically of malnutrition, energy shortage. But ticks probably have quite a bit to do with his death. So when wolves were introduced, and there's been fairly intrusive activities involving wolves, we also radio-collared moose for 4 years straight in order to get a better handle on some basic ecology questions involving moose and to see how the new wolf population might be affecting moose behavior, moose habitat selection. And I've been quite surprised that the depth of the effects of wolves on moose behavior is really incredible. So the lower right-hand map shows the one day last December where the various radio-collared moose were living. And then the map in the upper left shows the travels of one moose, and I think these are hourly locations. If you've been to Isle Royale, this is the Muskie Basin Campground. This was a cow moose that had a 12-month-old calf, and she mostly lived in campgrounds during the summer because they're safe spots, and wolves tend to avoid these campgrounds. But it was time for her to have a calf last spring, and she went over along the shore to this location, probably had a calf, and probably lost it. This rather sudden movement, I suspect, was caused by wolves, and if she did have a calf, she probably lost it at that point to wolves. And these kinds of sudden long distance movements are we think generally associated with wolves showing up. And if you're a cow moose with a calf, there's just nothing more important than providing that calf with the safest possible place. So they'll endure poor forage or poor living conditions in order to provide a remote, safe spot for that calf out of the way of wolves. Another example. This was a cow moose who raised her calf mostly in Daisy Farm Campground, or the largest campground on the island. And she was rarely seen actually by people, but she would be in the campground, especially at night when wolves were most active. And in the daytime, she would go out on the trails and forage just a little bit off trail, such that she was rarely seen. But last October, all the ferries had shut down. People weren't coming to the island anymore. Daisy Farm was depopulated of humans. And one day we watched this cow moose bring her calf swimming right across the harbor to our base camp. By that time, we were the only people left on Rock Harbor. And so she just came right ashore in front of us. And she knew exactly what she was doing, but her little bull calf, 12 months old, was pretty nervous about all this business, and but follows mom, and this is how they learn how to avoid wolves. And then, of course, we left in 2 weeks, and then they really are completely on their own. So that's kind of a rough update on what the wolves and moose are doing since wolves were restored. And our annual report out in another month or two will provide the update. But it's a continuation of wolves flourishing and moose and beaver as well going down pretty fast. So the next topic, though, has to do with the larger effects of wolves on the ecosystem, and it's inspired a lot by Yellowstone and an interest in how wolves may have led to resurgence in aspen and willow in Yellowstone. And then there's a popular, somewhat true video called "How Wolves Change Rivers." I think it's mostly not true, but there's an element of truth in it. And that's been downloaded and viewed, tens of millions of times. So there's this common notion that when wolves are restored, they just fix everything, and that's certainly an overstatement. But I did want to update on a story from Isle Royale that shows how wolves may affect aquatic systems in addition to terrestrial systems. So the Yellowstone story focuses on aspen, which were for about 70 years, aspen regeneration was totally stopped by an overabundant elk population. And then everything changed in the 1990s. Wolves, of course, were introduced. Grizzly bears recovered on their own. And cougars, mountain lions also recovered during the 1990s. And black bears were around all the time. But the three big carnivores, wolves, grizzlies, and mountain lions, all kill elk. And then elk are hunted outside the park. And the result of all that activity meant that elk went from about 20,000 animals in the early 90s to about 6,000 in the late 90s. And then they've been held at that fairly low level by predation. Grizzly bears kill the calves. They kill most of the calves that are born each year. Wolves, of course, kill a lot of adult elk as well as calves. And mountain lions actually kill as many adult elk as wolves do. So it's a totally transformed place. But it's all on land. It's all terrestrial stuff. And moose is a very different kind of creature, and feeds underwater a lot. In fact, that big long nose of a moose has a lot of muscles and ligaments that are adapted to allow it to close its nostrils by just thinking about it. It can will its nose to close, which is something we can't do at all. So moose spend a lot of time under the water feeding, and we don't know as much as we'd like to know about what they're doing down there, how much they remove, whether they're choosy at all or not. If you wonder, that lesion on the shoulder of that moose is essentially a wart, a papilloma virus, just like a human wart. And the moose itself, this moose died 2 months later after it was gored by another bull. We got a little bit of insight on what moose do underwater in 2004, a long time ago now, when we put a underwater remotely operated vehicle on the bottom of Lake Superior Bay in front of a moose. And it just worked really well. The moose cooperated. The rover was relatively safe. And we learned a couple things. They eat anything they see down there. They're not selective at all. You don't see any bubbles. And that's because of these nice muscles and ligaments that close their nostrils. Their eyes are wide open. And there's a little yellow submarine right in front of that moose, but it's not afraid of it at all. The danger all comes from above the water. So every now and then the moose looks around and checks out to make sure everything is safe. And then it went back underwater. We were getting a little nervous because we had borrowed this underwater system, and it cost a lot of money, and we didn't trust what moose might do to it. But we were just very lucky. But we vowed never to do it again because there's a long extension cord running from the little yellow submarine to our boat. And we could imagine all kinds of trouble that a moose might get into. So a lot of film producers have been anxious to recreate these underwater shots with, high definition cameras, but nobody's been able to put it all together yet. So we keep showing this old kind of moderate quality footage. So the story involves Lake Ojibwe, which is one of the 50 named lakes on Isle Royale. It was formed in the 1950s when beavers dammed up a kind of a natural seep. And the top photograph shows the extent of Lake Ojibwe. It had the largest beaver colonies found on the island in 2006. And those beaver colonies were successful primarily because they never had to go out of the water and expose themselves to wolf predation. There was enough aquatic plants that beavers could feed on, and aquatic plants are very high in protein. So beavers could chow down on all those aquatic plants and do just fine. And everything was rolling along somewhat sustainably. And then in 2007, we looked at Lake Ojibwe and saw all this green plant material on the surface. And it was really remarkable. It just covered all of the shallow portion of the lake. And this is water shield, which is a native floating leaf aquatic plant. In the inset there, you can see it's kind of like a lily pad. And it shades out all the other aquatic plants, so it outcompetes all the other plants. It's very high in protein, and it's a wonderful food source for both beaver and for moose. And moose, over a period of 3-4 years, found this resource and began to feed on it very, very actively, to the point where by 2013 or so, we'd seen as many as 15 moose at one time. Maybe 30 different moose in one day would come to Lake Ojibwe and spend a couple hours feeding on this plant and then go back. We didn't have any idea where all this was going to go. Fortunately, there was a PhD student named Brenda Bergman who, just by chance at that time, put up an exclosure in Lake Ojibwe and several other lakes to see what the effect of beaver and moose feeding was on aquatic plants. And she put up this circular fence and then excluded both beaver and moose from half of it, and then just moose from the other half. And from this experimental setup, she discovered that moose eat about 10 times more aquatic plants than beaver do. So they can completely overwhelm what beavers do in terms of feeding and outcompete beaver. And that's exactly what they did. Let's see, I think what happened next was totally unpredictable. But in November 2017, the main beaver dam holding back the lake broke. And prior to that, moose had removed all the food that beavers were depending on, and they were forced to go on to shore and start to cut birch and aspen trees on land the way beavers often do. But in doing that, they exposed themselves to wolf predation. So wolves were starting to pick them off, and then there was this catastrophic drainage of the pond, and then wolves really went to town and gained access to the beaver lodges themselves and just basically cleaned up all the beaver. And I'll show you a video taken by a remote camera that shows one of the two wolves left on Isle Royale, the male. And when I start the video, you can see as he turns around that his stomach is bulging. His stomach is full of beaver, and he's carrying a kit beaver, a baby beaver in his mouth, one that he couldn't even swallow, as he scent marks one of the pieces of vegetation there. And then 4 minutes later, the female followed suit with her stomach was likewise full to the brim. Prior to that, let me back up if I can. This is what the lake looked like before the dam broke. The moose had completely muddied up the entire shoreline. The water itself looked like an open sewer. I suspect if you owned this pond, you would be violating state water quality regulations. But it really made a mess of the lake. So, but we still couldn't predict what was going to happen. And in the end, the lake drained for the most part. And fortunately, there's a good pollen record for this lake that was taken in the 1990s that shows that the lake is really just a rain puddle, a rain collection, a depression with no real inlet and no real outlet, except for groundwater. And it was formed about 8,000 years ago when the glaciers first left Isle Royale. Water shield has a very distinctive pollen. It's been there for 8,000 years, but at a very low level. So when Lake Superior drained, what we saw was this mud flat full of about 5 meters of organic ooze in the bottom that's been collecting there for thousands of years. And then you can see all the cut stumps, which beavers took care of in the 50s when they first dammed this place up. That mud is very soft. I mean, you can't walk out on it, and even moose can't walk out on it. Some moose. We've seen 8 moose that have perished in this mud. It's mostly calves and very old moose whose viability was already compromised. This particular bull died 3 days after this photo was taken, and we eventually got his bones after wolves consumed his carcass, and both of his lower jaws had been broken some weeks before he got stuck, and he basically couldn't feed at all. So he was in remarkably poor condition. So ironically, the mud was a pretty selective mortality factor for moose. So that's the end of that story. But it brought home to me just how widespread the indirect effects of wolves are. And just today, I was talking with Sarah Hoy, and she was very excited about a graph that she showed me, which showed that the carbon-nitrogen balance of balsam fir trees is largely a function of wolf density, because wolves affect moose, and moose affect balsam fir trees, and moose herbivory affects the carbon-nitrogen balance of these trees. So the effect of wolves even extends into the chemistry of the plants themselves. But I'll close on this last slide with a quote by Tom Hobbs from Colorado State University, and he's kind of a naysayer about the whole Yellowstone story. He's studied willow recovery in Yellowstone for many years. They said predators are so important that their removal has such long-lasting effects that it's naive to think that you can quickly reverse the effects of their absence by restoration. But Isle Royale may be one of the places where we'll see how well we can reverse the effects of wolf absence. There were many years of delay before wolves were restored, and that turned out to be pretty critical in allowing moose to completely annihilate a whole cohort of balsam fir trees that did promise to grow into the forest canopy for the first time in over 70, 80 years. So we'll see what happens next. But the big scientific story is whether, now that we've restored wolves, whether the rules will be just the way they always have been, and that we won't learn anything particularly new. But I'm guessing that we are going to learn something very new, and that wolves may produce a period of very low moose density, which will fundamentally change the forest for the better, though, I think. So maybe it's time for me to stop talking, and I'll try to entertain any questions.
So I have a question. So if wolves can't get to the island anymore because of the lack of ice, as you know, global climate change happens, I see the problem is that if the national park introduces wolves, then they're going to end up having to manage the whole, prey and predator situation. So wouldn't it be better at some point to just let it, go the way it's going to go, rather than, do they have plans into the future to manage the whole predator prey situation?
No, that's a key question. And the answer is no. The time horizon for the National Park Service is 20 years. And beyond that, who knows what's going to happen. But there is no long-term plan to fine-tune this system at all. But it was it was strongly resisted within the National Park Service, because they have a tradition of non-manipulation and non-management. But in the end, after years of, well, actually, it was the public. It was the public and the public response period during the EIS that completely turned the Park Service around. So if you ever think that your input is not important, this was a case when public input really forced the agency itself, I think, to switch direction. Because the input was about 80 to 90% in favor of having wolves on Isle Royale. Some of those responses indicated that they didn't want to introduce wolves before the first population was completely gone. But in the end, almost 90% of the public said, yeah, the island should have wolves at this time. And the Park Service is pretty sensitive to public sentiment of that sort. I mean, if you had a politician running 90% approval, you'd have a pretty secure politician. So it really was public demand that turned the Park Service around. And in terms of intensive management, at the most, if wolf inbreeding continues to be a problem, maybe every 20 or 30 years, a new start would have to be taken. But the vegetation itself is probably not stable enough, given climate change, to think that 75 years from now, the forest is going to look the way it does now. That will have a lot to do with climate change, new insect pests, and we may have a completely different sort of forest, or no forest at all, in by the end of this century. So, Stacy, I don't know if you want to manage questions or chats or any.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so if any of you have any questions for Rolf, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
The lake you're talking about, is that the lake in the picture that kind of has gone to mud now?
No, the lake in the picture is a little unnamed bog, which is similarly kind of hazardous for moose to get into. But actually, the wolves that are shown here learned during this summer, this was in 2008, that they could force moose into this pond and kill them in the water.
Kind of trap them.
So in the middle of the summer, they killed a moose right in Mosque Basin Campground. They got this bull out in the pond in October, and it died there. And then the next year in 2009, we pulled the carcass out of the pond to get the bones that we were interested in. The wolves finally had a chance to feed on it, but it's been sitting underwater for 6 months.
So the lake you're talking about, what you said, it was very old, but must have been much smaller before they dammed it up then?
Oh, it was, yeah. Lake Ojibwe was about half as big for most of its history until beavers dammed it in the 50s. And of course, we don't know what, over thousands of years, whether beavers came and went and whether they had any similar effects. But fortunately, the 8,000-year pollen record told us a lot about the history of the lake.
Okay.
Sarah has a question for you, Rolf. She says 19 wolves were introduced in 2018, 2019. She's wondering how many wolves are on Isle Royale now.
There were 28 this past winter, in 2022. And then the count this winter is consistent with those 28 wolves flourishing. But the various agencies have to get their head wrapped around our new numbers before we can release them. That should be in a month or so. But it's completely consistent with 28 wolves flourishing.
So how many moose are there? Your earlier chart looked like there was thousands and thousands of moose, and I didn't think that'd be correct. But
well, there were close to 2,000 moose in 20. well, let's see, 2018, I think. And there's less than half that now.
Oh, so there's a lot more moose than wolf. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's long term. The average is about 30 moose per wolf.
Oh, okay. Oh.
So Becky has a question for you, Rolf. Will the
Okay.
wolf pups cross boundaries to breed when they're old enough, or do they stick to the territory where they're raised?
Oh no, all wolves born into a pack eventually leave that pack and leave that territory. And they're looking for mating opportunities outside of the original family. Sometimes, usually it doesn't work. They're unable to find a mate, unable to find space. They may just keep traveling, and they may go for thousands and thousands of miles, or they may just come home and raid the refrigerator at home for another couple of years. So all of those things happen, but the most wolves do leave home just pretty much the way most teenagers eventually leave home. Things just get too tense around home, and they take off.
So Nick is interested in having you expand on your comment about wolves and the aspen fir indicators. It just disappeared here. Hold on. And the aspen fir indicators, how do wolves impact the indicators you referenced?
In terms of balsam fir, all the effects of wolves at Isle Royale come through their predation on either moose or beaver. So to the extent that moose and beaver have a lot to do with the way the forest looks, that's where wolves have their indirect influence. And of course, beaver have a massive effect on the forests around water bodies. And the distance that beavers can safely go from their ponds is a function of whether there's wolves present or not. So in the years when we were down to just a couple wolves, beavers were foraging far from their ponds, going up and over ridges, cutting aspen 200 meters from their pond. They aren't doing that anymore. And so they're now restricted to a much closer distance. But you can see the effect of beavers on the forest from satellites. I mean, it's that dramatic because they remove deciduous trees up to about 50 meters or so from the water. And that leads to coniferous trees coming in and to replace those deciduous trees. Then the effect of moose at Isle Royale is just massive. There's not a square meter of Isle Royale that's not visited by moose every year. And they eat all the deciduous plants, the woody deciduous plants. But they rely on balsam fir in the winter time, not because it's good to eat, but it's just the only thing left. But it's full of, that nice Christmas smell of balsam fir. Those are terpenoid compounds that are poisonous to moose. And so they have to detoxify their food, which takes a lot of liver action. And so most of these members of the deer family can handle about one species of conifer. White-tailed deer eat white cedar, moose eat fir, mammoths probably ate, or mastodons probably ate spruce. Spruce grouse eat spruce. But rarely does anything eat more than one of those conifers, because all of them have pretty strong chemical protection.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and then I see John has his hand up. So let's see. We have a question about, don't you end up with inbreeding issues in the moose as well, or can they swim back and forth?
Excellent question. We've wondered for decades about this, and we just published a paper this year on the genetics of Isle Royale moose, and it looks like they were founded by possibly as few as two individuals about 120 years ago, early 1900s. They are all very genetically similar. They are inbred. but we don't see the kinds of deleterious effects that we saw in the wolves. And we think it's because the inbreeding happened over such a long period of time, very, very slowly. And over the century or so that moose have been present, they've been slowly purged of deleterious genes. That's currently the level of our thinking about moose. And we, for the wolves, we saw that every wolf since 1994 had spinal abnormalities, mostly asymmetrical vertebrae. And we've only seen that in 2 moose out of 5,000 that we've looked at.
So Carl, I think, is wondering, has the Isle Royale project been considered for an LTER, long-term ecological research center? It seems that the Isle Royale is an exemplar of sustainable predator-prey ecological systems.
Yeah, you're referring to LTER, which is a National Science Foundation program where certain sites have a well-developed and comprehensive research strategy. No, the short answer is no. I think Isle Royale is widely considered to be just a little too unique, but in the end, every site is unique. But we do have long-term funding through something called the LTREB, Long-Term Ecological Research, LTREB, sort of a smaller sister of the LTER program in the National Science Foundation. So there is some long-term funding, a very small program in NSF, but that's where our support comes from NSF.
John, and then Diane.
Hi, Ralph. I was up there in 2009. I'll put up a little photo clip on share. So it was actually the time that Ely was partnered with Michigan Tech and the Ely Wolf Center. I came up there with an educated vacation trip with my dad.
Oh, good.
You looked a little younger, but are they still doing those trips? I sure appreciated that. It was one of the best memories I ever had experienced with my father. And it was, probably a 7-week trip or 7-day trip, kind of staying on the main bay. We canoed and camped. But we went to your place, and people can click on the link there and see the mausoleum. Maybe you can talk about that trip and see if it's an option for us today.
Oh yeah, the site you visited is known as Bangsund Cabin, Bangsund. It's a Norwegian name. So you can just actually search the internet for Bangsund, Bangsund, and we'll come up. But yeah, we can't be reached except by water, but any visitor is welcome to come by. And we do have probably the world's largest collection of antlered moose skulls in the backyard, and that's a pretty amazing sight for anybody to see. And we get a couple thousand people a year that come and figure out how to get there. The Rock Harbor Resort does run a tour boat to the Edison fishery 3 times a week, and from there you can just walk a short distance and find us. So yeah, it's a good site to come visit, but we're not on the tour schedule, so we're not in any of the brochures, but all the rangers know we're there.
Yeah. Is the Ely Wolf Center still in partnership with Michigan Tech, running that trip every couple of years?
No, that only lasted 2 or 3 years, but it was a good program. But it's kind of the brainchild of one of their program directors, and she moved on, and other people had other ideas. So,
okay. Well, there's some pictures in the link. Thank you for your service. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Diane.
Hey, I'm Diane's son. I've been listening a little bit. I was going to ask, do you have any information about how the loss of caribou in northern Minnesota impacts the moose and wolf relationship, or like the populations, I guess?
Yeah, caribou disappeared in Minnesota in the 1920s after a century of heavy, shooting and lots of habitat change, and they've disappeared from almost the entire Lake Superior region. They disappeared from Isle Royale in the early part of the 20th century. In the end, they were left only on Michipicoten Island and Slate Islands. And wolves got to both of those islands, ironically, in about 2014. And on Slate Islands, all the caribou were killed by wolves, and then the wolves died out. Michipicoten Island, all the caribou were wiped out, but the wolves were propped up by beaver. So it was everybody wanted the Michipicoten wolves to just be moved to Isle Royale, and that would open up Michipicoten again as a caribou refuge, which is desperately needed, because there really are just a few dozen caribou left in the entire Lake Superior watershed. So what the long-term effects of that are, nobody knows. Caribou do eat quite a bit of lichens, which is something moose don't eat a lot of, especially in the ground lichens. But beyond that, I don't think we can say much at all. So there are efforts to try to recover caribou on the mainland of Ontario. That's going to be a long slog. And then if wolves can be, I mean, if Michipicoten Island can be shown to be wolf-free, moose or caribou, pardon me, will probably be restored to Michipicoten to provide at least a population. But yeah, they are desperately on the edge of extinction.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. This is kind of about going to Isle Royale recreationally. Are there hiking and camping areas in the area, and how would one safely hike and camp with the wolves?
Oh yeah, first question or the second question is easy. You don't have to worry about wolves at all. They're quite afraid of people, and they're rarely seen. If last summer, I think people saw wolves, I mean, less than half a dozen times. And so, yeah, there are about 180 miles of very nice hiking trails. And there are campsites, campgrounds with three-sided Adirondack shelters along Lake Superior shore. And then in the interior campground areas, it's tents only. So it's a nice place to go backpacking, and Isle Royale is probably the least visited, and it's said to be the most revisited park in the national park system. It does get busy in late July and August. And June is kept relatively human free because of the insect pests. But they're not that bad along Lake Superior shoreline.
Thanks for watching this Minnesota Rovers presentation. If you want to see more, please click on the link to our channel or the subscribe button below. Thank you.